History remembers great naval battles, powerful empires, and legendary explorers. But few remember the disease that nearly stopped all of it. Before ships met their enemies, before sails rose over new continents, crews were already fighting a losing war inside their own bodies. Wounds that wouldn't heal, bruises appearing without cause, exhaustion that hollowed out entire decks. A single missing nutrient was enough to cripple armies long before the first cannon fired. That silent force was a disease known as scurvy.
To understand scurvy, you must first understand the quiet machinery that keeps the human body from falling apart. Hidden beneath the skin, in every bone, every vessel, every strand of connective tissue, there is a single molecule that acts like the stitching of a vast biological tapestry. Its name is collagen, the protein responsible for holding the body together, giving structure to skin, strength to blood vessels, stability to joints, and resilience to bones. Without collagen, the human body gradually loses its architecture, piece by piece, as if the internal scaffolding were dissolving. But collagen cannot be built without one vital ingredient, vitamin C. It is the spark that activates the entire process. And unlike most animals, humans cannot produce this vitamin on their own. We must obtain it from fresh food, fruits, vegetables, the simple gifts of the earth. When that supply disappears, when weeks turn into months without any source of vitamin C, the consequences unfold with chilling precision. The earliest signs appear in the mouth. The gums loosen and bleed because the tiny fibers that anchor them begin to fail. Teeth shift in their sockets. Then the hair weakens, losing its integrity, twisting into strange shapes before falling out altogether. Muscles ache, bones soften, and the body becomes vulnerable to even the smallest impact. The blood vessels, once firm and elastic, start to rupture under the slightest pressure. Bruises spread across the skin like ink in water, a map of quiet internal bleeding. Wounds, even the smallest scratches, refuse to heal. Without collagen, the body cannot weave new tissue, cannot close its own injuries, cannot seal the openings left by daily life. What begins as fatigue and tenderness escalates into a terrifying unraveling, swollen limbs, open sores, spontaneous bleeding, and intense pain as the structural fabric of the body deteriorates. Inside, the damage is worse. Organs bleed, joints fill with fluid. The circulatory system begins to leak from the inside out. It is a collapse not of a single organ, but of the entire biological framework. Slowly, inexorably, the body loses the ability to support life. And the most haunting part? Scurvy does not strike with violence. It kills quietly, gradually, as if the body is melting from within. A sailor may be walking, then limping, then unable to stand. Within weeks, he is too weak to lift his arms. Within months, the collapse becomes irreversible. Death arrives not through sudden trauma, but through a slow surrender of every system that keeps a person alive. This is scurvy, the disease that does not attack from the outside, but patiently dismantles the human body from the inside until nothing remains but exhaustion, bleeding, and silence. On the open oceans of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, a ship was more than a vessel. It was a world sealed off from everything the human body depended on. The moment the ropes were cut and the sails caught the wind, crews stepped into a reality where time stretched endlessly and the comforts of land disappeared behind them. Food became a matter of endurance rather than nourishment. Fresh produce vanished within days. What remained were barrels packed with salted meat so tough it needed hours of boiling, and biscuits baked to survive years, not to preserve health. These rations filled stomachs, but they offered nothing the body required to maintain itself. Weeks at sea dulled the senses, but months transformed the ship into a floating laboratory of decay. Men who had boarded with strength and confidence began to weaken in ways no one could explain. It started subtly, a strange heaviness in the legs after climbing the rigging, bruises appearing where no injuries had occurred, fatigue that sleep could not cure. Conversations among the crew shifted, filled with whispered worries about the familiar signs, symptoms that every experienced sailor had seen before and prayed never to face again. The disease struck with a cold, predictable rhythm. Around the second or third month of sailing, the first victims appeared. Their gums softened and bled as they tried to eat. Old scars reopened without cause. Muscles that once hauled ropes with ease trembled under the weight of simple tasks. The body, deprived of even the smallest trace of vitamin C, began to betray itself. Blood vessels ruptured, skin darkened with bruises, and teeth loosened as though the mouth itself were collapsing. Captains were powerless. The medical knowledge of the era offered no explanation. There was no understanding of nutrients, no concept of vitamins, no connection between diet and disease. To them, scurvy seemed to rise from the sea like a curse, choosing its victims at random. Remedies ranged from prayers to vinegar to seawater, all useless. Each voyage carried its own ticking clock, counting down from the day the last piece of fresh fruit was eaten. The monotony of the sailor's diet was not a choice, it was a necessity. Ships lacked the means to preserve fruits or vegetables for long journeys. Space was required for weaponry, tools, trade goods, or scientific equipment, not barrels of oranges destined to rot. The ocean demanded food that could withstand humidity, insects, mold, and time. Salt, flour, and hardtack survived. Vitamin C did not. As the months rolled on, scurvy became the enemy every sailor feared, but none could escape. The disease emptied hammocks, filled burial logs, and transformed strong crews into hollow versions of themselves. Sailors who had survived storms, battles, and shipwrecks often found themselves powerless against a condition caused by nothing more than absence. An absence of the one nutrient the human body cannot store, cannot produce, and cannot survive without. In this unforgiving ecosystem of salt, wood, and wind, scurvy rose to dominance, claiming more sailors than cannon fire ever did. It was a disease shaped entirely by the nature of ocean travel, and it ruled the seas for centuries.
Long before the great empires sent their fleets across the world, long before the age of exploration and the rise of global trade, scurvy had already carved its name quietly into the margins of ancient history. The earliest sailors to challenge the open seas, long before they understood the body's dependence on fresh food, left behind scattered hints of a mysterious illness that followed them wherever long journeys carried them. The Greeks were among the first to record it. Their early maritime expeditions pushed them far from Mediterranean shores, and in their writings there are descriptions of crews returning weakened, their legs swollen, their gums bleeding,
and their bodies marked with unexplained bruises. Physicians of the time struggled to interpret these symptoms. Some blamed the sea air. Others believed the long travel offended the balance of the humors. None came close to identifying the true cause. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. The longer the voyage, the more men fell ill. Centuries earlier, along the Nile, the ancient Egyptians also captured traces of the same shadowy disease. Their medical papyri describe conditions where wounds refused to heal, where the mouth decayed, and where bleeding erupted without injury. These accounts appeared not as isolated medical notes, but as recurring problems observed among workers and travelers, symptoms that today align almost perfectly with the progression of scurvy. Still, in a world where nutrition was not yet a science, such cases were attributed to curses, spirits, or imbalances that no ritual or remedy could fully explain. Across these early civilizations, a common thread emerged. The disease struck when people were removed from fresh foods for long periods, during voyages, during war campaigns, during seasonal shortages. Yet no ancient society recognized the link. They saw the symptoms, they recorded the decline, but the invisible mechanism behind it remained hidden for thousands of years. Thus, long before it devastated the fleets of Europe, long before it shaped the outcome of global wars, scurvy had already haunted humanity, quiet, persistent, and completely misunderstood. It waited patiently for the moment when sailors would venture farther, travel longer, and depend entirely on foods that carried none of the protection their bodies needed. And when that era arrived, the disease stepped out of the shadows and claimed its place as the most lethal companion of men at sea. Between the years 1500 and 1800, as European powers raced to explore, conquer, and chart the world, a silent killer rose to dominate the oceans, claiming lives on a scale unmatched by cannon fire, shipwrecks, or storms. This was the era when scurvy ruled the seas, with an authority more absolute than any admiral or monarch. And over those 3 centuries, it took the lives of an estimated 2 million sailors. 2 million men who left home to serve their nations, only to be defeated not by foreign armies or towering waves, but by a deficiency so small it could fit inside a single slice of fruit. The numbers are staggering. In some fleets, entire voyages were marked by death registers thicker than navigational logs. There were expeditions where half the crew perished before reaching the halfway point. Ships returning to port often limped in with skeletal crews, men too weak to stand, too swollen to move, or too delirious to recognize their own comrades. Captains recorded their anguish in journals, writing of crews collapsing while the ship drifted under the weight of unmanned sails. Many vessels never made it home at all. What makes these losses even more haunting is the comparison. Scurvy killed far more sailors than the enemy ever did. Naval battles, with all their fire and fury, claimed only a fraction of the lives that scurvy consumed in silence. Storms, those legendary forces that could splinter a ship and drown 100 men in minutes, were mild opponents by comparison. Even shipwrecks, piracy, and starvation combined could not match the relentless toll of this one illness. On the great timeline of maritime death, scurvy sits alone at the top, responsible for more suffering and loss than all the dangers of the sea combined. It was a disease uniquely suited to the world of long-distance exploration. As global empires expanded, fleets spent months isolated on the ocean, cut off from any source of fresh food. The longer the voyage, the more predictable the pattern became.
Some men fell ill after 8 weeks, others by the 12th. By the 3rd month, scurvy often tightened its grip, reducing crews to shadows of themselves. Bones weakened, wounds reopened, and men who were perfectly healthy at the start of the journey turned into frail, bleeding victims unable to climb the rigging or defend the ship. Entire empires paid the price. Exploration stalled, colonization slowed. Battles were lost not to superior tactics, but to the simple absence of vitamin C. It was a bitter irony. The great nations of the world could build ships capable of crossing oceans, but they could not preserve a nutrient fragile enough to vanish within days of leaving port. This was the golden age of death, a time when scurvy became the ocean's greatest predator, undetectable, unstoppable, and devastating beyond measure. And until the cure was understood, the disease would continue to shape the fate of nations and rewrite the maps of the world.
Scurvy has shaped some of the most dramatic tragedies ever recorded at sea, quietly determining the fate of voyages that were supposed to change the world. Among the countless expeditions shattered by this disease, a few stand out as haunting reminders of how powerless humanity once was against a simple nutritional deficiency. One of the most devastating examples came during Ferdinand Magellan's attempt to circle the globe. He began his voyage with 5 ships and 240 men, an elite force chosen to break through the unknown edges of the world. Yet as the fleet pushed deeper into uncharted waters and the months dragged on without a single fresh fruit or vegetable, scurvy crept through the decks like an invisible predator. Strong sailors collapsed, their joints swelling, their gums bleeding, their bodies failing in ways no one understood. By the time the expedition returned to Spain 3 years later, only 18 survivors remained. Not because enemy fleets had defeated them, and not because storms had shattered their ships, but because scurvy had hollowed the crew from within. Magellan himself never reached the end of his own voyage. The disease was the true architect of that tragedy. The French suffered losses just as catastrophic. Their ambitious expeditions, designed to expand trade routes and secure new territories, often failed long before reaching their destinations. Ships left port with hundreds of capable men ready for exploration or battle. But as the weeks at sea stretched into months, scurvy began its slow destruction. Sailors became too weak to climb the rigging or even stand. Captains wrote despairingly in their logs as they watched their crew deteriorate without any means to intervene. There were voyages where half the men were dead before the ship even sighted land, and others where the mission had to be abandoned entirely because there simply weren't enough able-bodied sailors left to operate the vessel. Some French fleets never reached their intended shores, turning back in defeat, not because of enemy confrontation, but because of an invisible threat they couldn't name. The Dutch and Portuguese, masters of some of the longest, most demanding sea routes in history, faced similar devastation. Their ships spent months crossing between Europe, Africa, India, and the Far East, and the vast length of these journeys made scurvy almost inevitable. Logs from Dutch vessels tell of crews reduced to skeletons, of ships arriving in Asian ports with barely enough men alive to anchor the vessel. Portuguese captains reported entire decks filled with the dead, wrapped in cloth and prepared for burial at sea. The disease killed with such cold efficiency that sailors across nations began calling it the sailor's butcher, a name born not from poetry, but from terrifying consistency. Unlike storms or naval battles, scurvy did not come suddenly. It came predictably, relentlessly, and without mercy. These disasters were not isolated events. They were part of a widespread pattern that stretched across centuries.
Empires rose and fell on the backs of their fleets, yet those fleets were crippled again and again by a disease caused not by microbes or wounds, but by the simple absence of fresh food. Entire missions collapsed. Military campaigns were delayed. Colonies went unreinforced. Even when ships survived the journey, they often arrived with crews too sick to fight, negotiate, or continue the mission. Scurvy shaped exploration, slowed expansion, and altered the balance of global power, one voyage at a time.
Scurvy didn't just kill sailors. It quietly reshaped the outcome of entire wars. Naval fleets often reached their battlefields carrying only half the strength they had when they left port. In countless confrontations, ships arrived with rows of empty hammocks, their crews reduced to shadows of soldiers. The men who did survive the journey were often too weak to lift cannons, climb masts, or even stand long enough to fight. Armies planned for enemy fire, but nothing prepared them for arriving at war already defeated by their own provisions. This weakness rippled through colonial ambitions as well. Expeditions meant to claim new territories slowed to a crawl, not because of political resistance, but because ships lost so many men before even sighting land. Some expeditions had to turn back. Others limped into foreign harbors with barely enough crew to anchor. The disease didn't just kill individuals, it stalled the machinery of empire itself. Records from the 7 Years' War revealed just how devastating this imbalance could be. In the British Navy, scurvy claimed 5 times more lives than enemy action. Battles were influenced not by strategy or firepower, but by which fleet had fewer men dying below deck. Victory hinged not on courage, but on access to fresh food. Meanwhile, on the fringes of the sea, a surprising group gained the upper hand: pirates. Unlike rigid European fleets, pirate crews frequently stopped at small islands to raid fresh fruit and vegetables. These unplanned resupply stops kept them immune to the disease that crushed official navies. While disciplined empires struggled to keep their men alive, pirate ships, chaotic, improvised, and constantly moving, sailed with healthier crews and stronger fighters. In the age of scurvy, it wasn't firepower or discipline that made the difference, but oranges. In 1747, aboard a British naval ship drifting somewhere in the Atlantic, a young surgeon named James Lind carried out an experiment that would quietly revolutionize medicine. The ship was filled with the familiar misery of scurvy: bleeding gums, swollen limbs, sailors collapsing where they stood. Lind had seen enough. Unlike the physicians of his time, he refused to believe the disease was a curse, a mood of the sea, or some imbalance of the body's mysterious humors. He suspected something far simpler and far more daring. He gathered a group of sailors already suffering from the illness and divided them into pairs. Each pair was given a different supposed cure chosen from the remedies commonly believed to work: vinegar, seawater, diluted sulfuric acid, cider, and even a paste of garlic and spices. Each treatment had supporters, theories, and centuries of tradition behind it. None of them had evidence. Then came the final pair: 2 sailors given nothing more exotic than lemons and limes. The effect was astonishing. Within 6 days, the 2 men eating citrus fruits were back on their feet, recovering faster than anyone aboard had ever seen. Their wounds began to heal, their strength returned, and the signs of scurvy faded almost as quickly as they had appeared. All the other treatments, every remedy sworn by captains, surgeons, and scholars, failed completely. In that moment, Lind had conducted something the world had never truly seen before: a controlled, organized clinical trial. A scientific test with comparisons, variables, and measurable outcomes. He hadn't just discovered a treatment, he had invented a method.
It was the first clinical experiment in the history of medicine, carried out not in a modern laboratory, but on the wooden deck of a warship battling disease in the open ocean. And although the world would take decades to understand the importance of Lin's discovery, his 6-day trial would eventually save millions of lives and change naval warfare, exploration, and global health forever. When the British Navy finally embraced the results of James Lin's discovery, history shifted in a way no empire could have predicted. At first, the solution seemed almost laughably simple: crates of lemons loaded onto warships, followed later by the tougher, longer-lasting lime. But the effect was nothing short of revolutionary. Sailors who once faced months of decline, men who arrived at battle half dead from scurvy, suddenly remained strong throughout entire voyages. The disease that had hollowed out fleets for centuries collapsed almost overnight. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Mortality at sea dropped not by a small margin, but by a staggering 90%. For the first time in naval history, Britain could send ships across the world without losing half the crew to an invisible enemy. Fleets arrived fully manned, soldiers were healthy enough to fight, explorers could push farther into unknown waters without the fear of their own bodies betraying them. This wasn't just a medical breakthrough, it was a strategic transformation. And as the death toll plummeted, Britain's power surged. The Royal Navy, once crippled by the same weaknesses that haunted every other maritime nation, became the most dominant force on the seas for the next 100 years. Battles tilted decisively in Britain's favor, not because of stronger cannons or faster ships, but because their sailors remained alive long enough to use them. Empires rise on countless factors, but in this case, citrus fruit played a role as significant as gunpowder. With time, the identity of the British sailor changed so dramatically that a new nickname emerged. The constant presence of limes aboard Royal Navy ships earned them the label limeys. What had started as a desperate attempt to preserve life became a badge of maritime superiority, a small word born from a massive shift in global power. The world often remembers empires for their victories, their weapons, their leaders. But sometimes history bends because of something far simpler, like the juice of a single fruit, saving the lives of men who would go on to shape the fate of nations.
For centuries, the map of the world grew only as fast as sailors could survive the journey, and scurvy slowed that progress to a crawl. Every attempt to push deeper into the Pacific came with a grim countdown. Explorers set out with dreams of charting new waters, only to watch their crews weaken before reaching the edges of the unknown. Entire expeditions meant to unlock the secrets of the Pacific Ocean stalled or turned back as men collapsed on deck, unable to continue. The disease didn't just kill sailors, it stopped discovery itself. Australia, too, remained largely untouched for generations, not because no one wanted to explore it, but because scurvy punished any voyage long enough to reach its distant shores. Ships that could have mapped coastlines or founded settlements instead arrived with crews barely alive, or they never arrived at all. What should have been milestones of exploration became tragedies recorded in ship logs and forgotten archives. Scientific expeditions suffered even more. The 17th and 18th centuries were filled with brilliant minds eager to study the stars, the oceans, new plants, and new lands. But their ships faced the same fate as war fleets, sailors fading long before the mission could begin. Botanists, astronomers, and cartographers depended on sailors to bring them across the world, and scurvy robbed them of that chance again and again. Breakthroughs that could have arrived decades earlier were delayed simply because the sea offered no mercy. Even global trade, especially the lucrative spice routes, was strangled by the disease. The journey to the East Indies was long, brutal, and unforgiving. Merchants lost fortunes as ships failed to complete their voyages, not due to piracy or storms, but because their crews were being undone from within. Markets, alliances, and entire economies shifted under the weight of a deficiency no one could name. But everything changed once the cure was finally embraced. With citrus aboard every ship, scurvy's grip on the world weakened almost overnight. Voyages that once took lives now took new routes. Ships sailed farther, faster, and with crews strong enough to complete their missions. The Pacific opened. Australia was explored. Scientific expeditions flourished. Trade routes stabilized. A wave of discovery surged across the globe, not because ships became faster or because nations became braver, but because sailors were finally healthy enough to survive the unknown. The world expanded the moment scurvy lost its throne.
Scurvy is often treated as a relic of the past, a disease buried alongside wooden ships and old navigational maps. But the reality is far more unsettling. The illness that once terrorized empires has quietly returned, hiding in the corners of modern life where no one expects it. The cure is known, the cause is simple, yet the disease still finds its way into bodies unprotected by proper nutrition. It appears in people whose lives drift far from balanced meals, heavy drinkers whose diets collapse under addiction, leaving their bodies starved of the nutrients needed for basic repair. It shows up in the elderly, whose access to fresh food is often limited, and whose weakened appetites make them vulnerable to deficiencies once thought impossible in the modern age. It slips into poor communities, where fruits and vegetables are luxuries rather than routine staples, where cheap calories replace real nourishment. Prisons report cases as well, a reminder that confinement can mirror the isolation of long sea voyages. The disease thrives wherever diets become rigid and repetitive, echoing the same conditions that once destroyed sailors hundreds of years ago. Even children, kids growing up on fast food and processed snacks, have shown symptoms of scurvy, their bodies protesting the absence of vitamins in meals designed for convenience rather than health. Despite all our scientific knowledge, the pattern has not changed. Remove fresh produce for long enough, and the body begins the same slow collapse that once emptied ships and rewrote the maps of the world. The gums soften, the skin bruises, fatigue settles deep into the bones. Without intervention, the condition progresses exactly as it did centuries ago. Scurvy never vanished. It simply waited for modern habits to open the door again. And in a world where nutrition is often an afterthought, the disease has found new ways to survive, quietly reminding us that even the simplest deficiencies can still shape lives in profound ways. For all the devastation scurvy brought to sailors and armies, its cause rests on a surprisingly simple truth. The human body cannot produce its own vitamin C. Most animals can synthesize it effortlessly, but humans, along with a handful of other species, lost that ability long ago. We rely entirely on food to supply it, yet our bodies cannot store it for long. Once it runs out, the consequences begin almost immediately, spreading through every system that depends on this fragile molecule. Vitamin C plays a role in more than 300 biological processes, but its most critical function is the creation of collagen, the protein that holds the body together. Without it,
Blood vessels weaken and rupture, gums decay, teeth loosen, and old scars begin to break open as if time were rewinding inside the flesh. The body bruises from the slightest touch. Internal bleeding becomes unavoidable. Even the immune system falters, leaving the weakened body defenseless against infections that would normally pose little threat. Tissues crumble, bones ache, fatigue becomes overwhelming. Inch by inch, the body begins to collapse from within. Scurvy is not just a disease, it is the physical unraveling of the human structure. And yet, the cure has always been astonishingly small. A lemon, a lime, a single fruit capable of stopping the entire process in its tracks. When sailors finally gained access to these citrus stores, the transformation was immediate and historic. Fleets that once crawled across oceans suddenly surged with strength. Explorers reached continents they had only dreamed of. Armies regained the ability to fight. Scientific voyages flourished. Trade routes expanded. Entire nations shifted their position in the global hierarchy. Had citrus not entered the story, the world map might look completely different today. Britain, weakened by scurvy, may never have risen to naval supremacy. The age of discovery could have been delayed by decades or centuries. Wars might have ended with different victors, and millions of sailors, soldiers, scientists, and explorers would have vanished beneath the waves long before completing their missions. History often turns on the actions of great leaders, decisive battles, or inventions that redefine human progress. But in this case, the hinge of global power rested on something far more humble, a small, bright fruit filled with the vitamin the human body cannot live without. A lemon changed the world, and in doing so, it saved it.